While being served by a waitress, Millionaire was paralyzed upon recognizing his youthful love. She was presumed dead 23 years ago. Samuel Carter adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit as he walked into a modest restaurant on the outskirts of Chicago. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling burgers, a stark contrast to the luxurious boardrooms and high-end restaurants where he usually conducted business. Today, he had decided to break from routine. Maybe it was the stress of the endless meetings or the weariness of a life defined by profit margins and power plays. But Samuel longed for something different, something grounding. As he scanned the room, he noticed the crowd, a mix of families, office workers, and a few loners hunched over their meals. The clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversations created a comforting hum. Taking a seat by the window, he gazed out at the bustling street, his thoughts drifting aimlessly until a waitress approached his table. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Her voice was soft, polite, with a warmth that caught his attention. Samuel looked up, and the world seemed to stop. The tray in her hand, the conversations around him. Even the air itself felt suspended in time. It was her, Lauren, or at least it looked like her. She seemed older, her face framed by faint lines that spoke of struggles and time past. But those eyes, those unmistakable, piercing eyes, were the same. The eyes that had haunted his dreams for over 2 decades. The same eyes he had mourned as lost forever. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't find his voice. He knew it was impossible. Lauren had died 23 years ago. The bus accident had been all over the news. And her father, Anthony Whitman, had insisted she didn't survive. Samuel had grieved, deeply and painfully, burying the love of his life, along with his hopes of a future with her. "Sir, would you like something to drink?" the waitress asked again, her brows furrowing slightly at his silence. Samuel blinked, struggling to form words. "Lauren," he whispered, almost inaudibly. The tray in her hand trembled slightly and her polite smile faltered. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. Samuel leaned forward, his voice a mix of disbelief and desperation. "It's me, Samuel. Samuel Carter." For a moment, her expression remained blank, as though the name meant nothing. Then, like a bolt of lightning, recognition flashed in her eyes. She stepped back, her breath hitching, and the tray slipped from her hands, clattering onto the table. "Samuel," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes locked on hers. "It's you, isn't it, Lauren Whitman?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. I don't understand. How are you here? How do you know my name?" "I should be asking you the same thing," Samuel replied, his voice trembling. "Lauren, everyone thought you were dead." The room around them seemed to blur, the noise fading into the background. For Samuel, it was as if the universe had narrowed down to just the two of them, suspended in a moment he never thought he'd experience. "I don't know what to say," Lauren whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't remember much. It's all so confusing." Samuel's heart ached at her words. The woman standing before him was both the love of his life and a stranger. "Can we talk somewhere private?" he asked gently. Lauren hesitated, glancing around the restaurant. Then she nodded. "Let me grab my things." Minutes later, they stood in the quiet alley behind the restaurant. The hum of the city seemed distant, leaving only the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Lauren wiped her hands nervously on her apron, her gaze flickering between Samuel and the ground. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "I've been piecing things together little by little, but it's like trying to assemble a puzzle with missing pieces." Samuel took a step closer, his voice soft but insistent. "Start with what you remember. Anything." Lauren drew a shaky breath. "I survived the accident," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't know how, but I woke up in a hospital. They told me I had been unconscious for days. I didn't know my name, my past, nothing. They said I had amnesia, and for years my life was blank." Samuel clenched his fists, his heart breaking at the thought of Lauren enduring such isolation. "What happened after that? I was sent to a convent in Savannah," she continued. "It was quiet there. The sisters took care of me. but I felt like I didn't belong. I stayed for years, trying to find some sense of who I was. It wasn't until recently that memories started to come back. Little flashes, faces, places, feelings. Samuel's mind raced. None of this made sense. "Your father," he said suddenly. "Did he know? Did he try to find you?" Lauren's expression darkened. "I don't know. I haven't thought about him in years. I can't imagine why he wouldn't look for me." Samuel's jaw tightened as anger simmered beneath the surface. Anthony Whitman had insisted Lauren was dead. He had orchestrated her funeral, convinced everyone of her passing. But why? Why would he abandon his own daughter? Leave her to fend for herself with no memory of who she was? "I'm going to find out," Samuel said, determination hardening his voice. "Whatever happened to you, Lauren, I'll uncover the truth." Lauren looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Why now, Samuel? After all this time?" "Because fate gave us another chance," he replied firmly. "And I'm not letting it slip away." Lauren stood motionless, her back against the cold brick wall of the alley, as Samuel's words hung in the air. It had been years since anyone had spoken her name with such certainty, such emotion. She felt a strange pull toward him, a tug in her chest that stirred the fragmented memories she had tried so hard to piece together. Samuel took a step closer, his presence steady and commanding, yet his expression softened with concern. "Lauren, do you remember anything else about that time? Anything about the accident?" She shook her head slowly, her arms wrapping around herself as though trying to hold the scattered pieces of her past together. "It's all bits and pieces," she admitted. "Sometimes I dream about people's faces, but they're blurry. There's a feeling of being pulled away, of something important slipping through my fingers, but I don't know what it means." Samuel's heart clenched. He could see the pain in her eyes, the frustration of someone who had lived in a fog for far too long. "What about the convent?" he pressed gently. "Did no one try to help you regain your memory? Find out who you were?" Lauren let out a bitter laugh, the sound tinged with years of suppressed anguish. "The sisters cared for me, but they weren't interested in digging into the past. They believed it was God's will that I forget, that starting over was my chance at redemption." She paused, her voice faltering. "I tried to believe that too, for a while, but deep down, I always felt like I didn't belong, like there was something, someone, out there waiting for me." Samuel took a deep breath, trying to quell the wave of anger rising within him. It wasn't directed at Lauren, but at the circumstances that had stolen her from him. "Lauren, you belonged with me," he said, his voice raw. "I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped wondering what could have been." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know how to process this, Samuel. You're here and it feels familiar, but I don't know if I'm the person you remember." "You're still you," Samuel said firmly, "and I'll help you remember. We'll figure this out together." They decided to continue their conversation at a nearby cafe, away from prying eyes and ears. The small, quiet space was a stark contrast to the chaos of their emotions. Lauren hesitated as they sat across from each other, clutching a steaming cup of tea. Samuel watched her carefully, noticing the way her hands trembled slightly. "Lauren," he began, breaking the silence. "The accident, it didn't make sense to me back then. I always felt like there was more to it, and now, hearing this, your survival, your father's silence, it only confirms that something was deliberately hidden." Lauren's gaze dropped to her tea, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "My father," she murmured, the words heavy with unresolved pain. "I don't know why he'd do this. I can't imagine what he thought he was protecting." Samuel leaned forward, his voice lowering. "What if it wasn't about protecting you? What if it was about protecting himself?" Her head shot up, confusion flashing across her face. "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet," Samuel admitted. "But Anthony was always calculating, always concerned about appearances. If he went as far as to declare you dead, there must have been something he was trying to hide, something he didn't want anyone to know." Lauren's hands tightened around her cup as she processed his words. The idea of her father orchestrating such a cruel deception felt both unthinkable and terrifyingly plausible. She had always known him as a controlling figure, someone who valued power above all else. But to erase her existence— "I need to know the truth," she said finally, her her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I can't keep living like this, not knowing who I am or why this happened." Samuel nodded. "And I'll help you. I'll start looking into it immediately. I have the resources, Lauren, and I won't stop until we have answers." A small spark of hope flickered in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't alone in this journey. "Thank you, Samuel," she said softly. "I don't know how to repay you for this." "You don't have to," he replied. "You're still the most important person in my life, Lauren. Helping you is the least I can do." That evening, as Samuel returned to his hotel, he placed a call to an old acquaintance, Jack Reynolds, a private investigator he had worked with in the past. Jack was sharp, resourceful, and relentless. Exactly the kind of person Samuel needed to dig into Anthony Whitman's past. "Jack, it's Samuel Carter," he said when the call connected. "Samuel, haven't heard from you in a while. What's going on?" Jack's voice was as gruff as ever, but there was a hint of curiosity beneath it. "I need your help," Samuel explained. "It's about someone I lost years ago. I need you to look into Anthony Whitman." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Whitman, the politician. That's a big name to go after. What are we talking about here?" Samuel hesitated for only a moment. "The truth," he said firmly. "I want to know everything about him, his connections, his secrets, especially from 23 years ago." Jack let out a low whistle. "Sounds serious, all right. I'll take it on. But this won't be easy, or cheap. Whatever it takes," Samuel replied without hesitation. "Just get me answers." As he hung up, Samuel stared out at the city lights twinkling beyond his hotel window. He could feel the weight of the task ahead, but for the first time in years, he also felt a sense of purpose. Lauren was alive, and he wouldn't rest until he uncovered the full truth of what had happened to her the next morning. Samuel awoke to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through his hotel room curtains. His mind raced with the events of the previous day. Lauren was alive, something he had never dared to hope for. And now he had the chance to uncover the truth about the tragedy that had torn their lives apart. But to do that, he needed answers about Anthony Whitman. As Samuel sipped his morning coffee, his phone buzzed on the table. It was Jack Reynolds, the private investigator. Samuel picked up immediately. "Jack, good to hear from you," Samuel greeted, his voice firm. "I've started digging," Jack replied. "Anthony Whitman's name brings up a lot of noise. He's got deep political roots, big money, and a whole lot of skeletons in his closet. I need more specifics if we're going to break this open. What exactly are you looking for?" Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want to know what happened 23 years ago. Specifically, around the time of Lauren's accident. There's something he's hiding." "Jack, he declared his own daughter dead, but she survived. Why would a father do that?" Jack let out a low whistle. "That's cold. If he's capable of that, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot more dirt to uncover. I'll start with his financial records, travel logs, and any oddities around that time frame. It'll take a few days, but I'll keep you posted." "Thanks, Jack. I appreciate it," Samuel said, hanging up. He leaned back in his chair, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. Anthony Whitman had always been a powerful figure, a man who thrived on control and reputation. Samuel knew he wouldn't give up his secrets easily. Later that day, Samuel met Lauren at a quiet park near her apartment. She looked different in the daylight, less like the waitress from the restaurant, and more like the woman he had loved all those years ago. Her expression was guarded, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. "Did you learn anything?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope and hesitation. "Not yet," Samuel admitted, "but I have someone looking into it. Anthony didn't just let this happen, Lauren. He orchestrated it, and I'm going to find out why." Lauren nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "I keep trying to remember more," she said. "Last night, I had a dream. I was in a hospital bed, and there was a man standing over me. I couldn't see his face, but I remember feeling afraid." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Do you think it was your father?" "I don't know," she whispered. "But the fear, it felt real." Samuel reached for her hand, his touch reassuring. "We'll figure it out, Lauren. You don't have to do this alone." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing this, Samuel? After all this time, After everything. Because you matter to me, he said simply. You always have. Lauren's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they still shared. Meanwhile, Jack was making progress. By the third day, he called Samuel with an update. Samuel, I've found something interesting, Jack began. Right around the time of Lauren's accident, Anthony made some unusual transactions. Large sums of money being funneled to a private institution in Savannah. It's a convent. Samuel's grip tightened on the phone. The same convent where Lauren was sent. Exactly, Jack confirmed. It looks like he paid them to take her in, keep her quiet. This wasn't just some coincidence. He planned this. Samuel's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture was still incomplete. What else do you have? There's more, Jack continued. Anthony also filed legal documents shortly after the accident, declaring Lauren legally deceased. That's not something you do unless you're trying to erase someone from existence. Samuel's breath caught. He wanted her gone, he said, his voice heavy. Why? My guess, Jack replied. To protect his reputation. Maybe there's something in Lauren's past, or yours, that he thought would be damaging. But whatever it is, he went to great lengths to bury it. Samuel clenched his fist. Keep digging, Jack. I want every detail. You got it, Jack said before hanging up. Samuel met Lauren again that evening, this time at a small diner she liked, over the hum of conversation and the clink of dishes. He told her everything Jack had uncovered. He paid them to take you in, Samuel explained. He didn't just leave you there. He made sure no one could find you. Lauren stared at him, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. But why? What could I have done that was so terrible? It wasn't about you, Samuel said, his voice steady. It was about him. Anthony has always been obsessed with appearances. If he thought something about your life didn't fit his image, he would have done anything to control it. Lauren's eyes filled with tears. All those years, I thought I was abandoned, forgotten. But he did this to me, my own father. Samuel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Lauren, this wasn't your fault. He was wrong, and now we have the chance to make it right. Lauren nodded, wiping her tears. I want to know everything, she said firmly. I need to understand why he did this, and what else he's hiding. As they left the diner, Samuel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to uncover the truth and give Lauren the closure she deserved. Little did they know, the secrets they were about to unravel would change everything they thought they knew about their past and their future. Lauren sat on the worn sofa in her small apartment, staring at the flickering light of a single candle on the coffee table. The silence of the room was heavy, broken only by the occasional hum of traffic from the street below. Her mind churned with the revelations Samuel had shared, each detail like a jagged piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet complete. The idea that her father had orchestrated her disappearance was too much to bear. Anthony Whitman had always been a figure of authority and control in her life, but she had never imagined he could be capable of such a betrayal. What had driven him to erase her existence? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She stood, her heart quickening, and opened it to find Samuel standing there, his expression calm yet resolute. "Can I come in?" he asked gently. She nodded, stepping aside. "I wasn't expecting you," she said as he entered. "I couldn't leave things the way we did," Samuel admitted, sitting down on the edge of the sofa. "You've been through so much, Lauren. I just wanted to check on you." Lauren gave a faint smile, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "I'm still trying to process everything. It's like my whole life was a lie." Samuel looked at her, his eyes filled with compassion. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "We'll face this together." The next day, Samuel made arrangements for them to visit the convent in Savannah. He believed that returning to the place where Lauren had spent so many years might jog her memory, or, at the very least, provide answers to the questions they both carried. The drive was long and quiet, with Lauren staring out the window, lost in thought, while Samuel focused on the road. As they approached the secluded convent, a sense of unease settled over Lauren. The sight of the familiar stone walls and tall gates brought a flood of mixed emotions: comfort from the years she had spent there, and a deep sense of longing for the life she had been denied. The sisters welcomed them with polite smiles, but Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that some of them recognized her more than they let on. Sister Agnes, the head of the convent, greeted them warmly. "Lauren," Sister Agnes said, her voice kind but measured. "It's been many years. What brings you back here?" Lauren hesitated, glancing at Samuel before responding. "I'm trying to understand my past," she said softly. "There are things I can't remember, things I need to know." Sister Agnes' expression faltered briefly, but she quickly composed herself. "The past can be a heavy burden," she said. "What is it you're looking for?" Samuel stepped forward, his tone firm but respectful. "We believe someone paid for Lauren to be sent here after an accident 23 years ago. We need to know who arranged it and why." Sister Agnes looked between them, her hands tightening around the rosary she held. "This is not a matter I can speak of freely," she said. "But I can tell you that the arrangement was made to protect Lauren. At least, that was how it was presented to us." Lauren frowned. "Protect me from what? From whom?" Sister Agnes hesitated, her eyes searching Lauren's face. "I don't know the full truth," she admitted, "but I was told it was for your safety. The person who brought you here insisted it was the only way." "Who was it?" Samuel asked sharply. Sister Agnes looked away, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It was a man, well-dressed, with a commanding presence. He said his name was Anthony Whitman." The confirmation sent a chill through the room. Samuel clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. "He didn't bring her here to protect her," he said, his voice low. "He brought her here to hide her." Lauren's breathing quickened as the weight of Sister Agnes's words sank in. "Why would he do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What was he trying to hide?" "I don't know," Sister Agnes said regretfully. "But if you're looking for answers, you won't find them here. Everything we know was dictated by Mr. Whitman. We never questioned his motives." Samuel nodded tightly. "Thank you for your time," he said curtly, guiding Lauren out of the room. On the drive back to the city, Lauren was uncharacteristically quiet. Samuel glanced at her, sensing the turmoil beneath her calm exterior. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "I don't know," she admitted. Hearing her say his name, it makes everything feel more real. He's not just a distant figure anymore. He's the reason my life turned out this way. Samuel reached over, placing a comforting hand on hers. "We're getting closer, Lauren. Every piece of the puzzle brings us one step closer to the truth." Lauren nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "What if the truth is worse than we imagined?" she whispered. Samuel didn't answer right away. Instead, he tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw set with determination. "Then we'll face it together," he said finally, "no matter what." That night, as Samuel returned to his hotel room, his phone buzzed. It was Jack Reynolds. "Samuel, I've got something big," Jack said without preamble. "It's about the accident." Samuel's pulse quickened. "What did you find?" "There's evidence suggesting the bus crash wasn't an accident," Jack revealed. "The brakes were tampered with. Someone wanted that bus to go off the road." Samuel felt the air leave his lungs. "You're saying someone tried to kill Lauren?" "Not just Lauren," Jack said grimly. "Everyone on that bus. It was a cover-up. Someone didn't want survivors." Samuel's mind reeled as he ended the call. The stakes had just been raised, and the truth was darker than he could have imagined. The gravity of Jack's revelation weighed heavily on Samuel as he sat alone in his hotel room. The idea that the bus crash wasn't an accident but a deliberate act was almost too much to process. Who would orchestrate something so monstrous? And why? He stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, his thoughts circling around Anthony Whitman. The man had always been ruthless, but could he be capable of this? The following morning, Samuel met Lauren at a small cafe near her apartment. She was already seated at a corner table, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. Her face lit up with a faint smile when she saw him, but the worry in her eyes betrayed her. "You look tired," she said softly as he sat down. Samuel hesitated, unsure how to tell her what Jack had discovered. "There's something you need to know," he began, his tone serious. "It's about the accident." Lauren's expression shifted, her hand stilling over her coffee cup. "What is it?" Samuel leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Jack found evidence that the crash wasn't an accident. Someone tampered with the bus's brakes." Her eyes widened in shock. "What? But Why would someone do that? Samuel took a deep breath. We don't have all the answers yet, but it's clear someone wanted to eliminate everyone on that bus. And given what we know about your father's involvement in your disappearance, I can't help but think he had something to do with it. Lauren's hands trembled as she processed his words. You think my father tried to kill me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Samuel reached out, placing a steadying hand over hers. I don't want to believe it either, Lauren, but the evidence points in his direction. We need to dig deeper. Lauren pulled her hands back, her breathing uneven. This is too much, she said, her voice cracking. First, I find out he erased me from my own life. And now this. What kind of father would do something like this? Samuel's heart ached at her pain. We'll get to the bottom of it, he promised. You deserve the truth, no matter how hard it is to face. That evening, Samuel called Jack for an update. Jack's voice was laced with urgency when he answered. I've uncovered more about the crash, Jack said. The bus company reported brake issues a week before the accident, but no repairs were ever made. And get this. The company was owned by a shell corporation linked to Anthony Whitman. Samuel gritted his teeth. So, he not only orchestrated Lauren's disappearance, but also controlled the circumstances of the crash. It looks that way, Jack confirmed. But there's more. I found a witness. Someone who worked for the bus company at the time. They're willing to talk. Samuel's mind raced. A witness could be the key to unraveling the full truth. Set up a meeting, he said. I'll be there. The next day, Samuel and Jack met the witness, a former mechanic named Roy, in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city. Roy was a wiry man with a nervous demeanor, his eyes darting around the room as though expecting someone to jump out at him. I don't want any trouble, Roy said as he sat down. I've kept my mouth shut for years, but I can't live with the guilt anymore. You're safe here, Samuel assured him. We just want to know the truth about the crash. Roy shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with a napkin. I was told to let the bus go out without repairs, he admitted. The brakes were failing, and we knew it, but the order came from up top, not to touch it. Who gave the order? Samuel pressed. Roy hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. It came from the owner, Anthony Whitman. Samuel felt his stomach drop. The confirmation was like a punch to the gut, but it also fueled his determination. Why would he want that bus to crash? He asked, his tone sharp. I don't know, Roy said. All I know is that a few days later, I was paid off to keep quiet. A big envelope of cash and a warning not to say a word. Jack leaned forward. Do you have any proof of this? Anything that links Whitman directly to the crash? Roy nodded hesitantly. I kept one of the memos. It's not much, but it's signed by his people. Give it to us, Jack said. We'll protect you. Roy hesitated for a moment before pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket. Samuel took it, his eyes scanning the document. It was an internal memo, subtly phrased but unmistakably instructing the staff to ignore the maintenance issues. At the bottom, a signature, one of Anthony Whitman's associates. This is a start, Samuel said, his voice firm. Thank you, Roy. You've done the right thing. Roy nodded, relief washing over his face. I hope you bring him down, he said, before slipping out of the diner, as Samuel returned to his hotel that night. He felt a mix of anger and resolve. The pieces were falling into place, each revelation painting a darker picture of Anthony Whitman's actions. Samuel knew the fight ahead would be tough, but he was more determined than ever to expose the truth. When he called Lauren to update her, she listened in silence. When he finished, her voice was steady but laced with pain. If my father did this, she said, then he's not the man I thought he was. But I need to hear it from him. I need to confront him. Samuel hesitated. Are you sure you're ready for that? I have to be, Lauren said. I can't keep living in the shadows of his lies. Samuel nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Then we'll confront him together. As they ended the call, Samuel stared out at the city lights, knowing the battle they were about to face would change everything. For better or worse, Samuel parked his car in front of Lauren's apartment the next morning, his thoughts racing as he prepared to tell her the news. Jack had called him late last night with another revelation, one that left him both stunned and filled with hope. He knew it was going to be a difficult conversation, But he also knew Lauren deserved to know everything. Lauren greeted him at the door, her expression tired but determined. She stepped aside to let him in, closing the door behind him as she crossed her arms, her usual composure slipping just slightly. "You look like you've been up all night," she observed. "I have," Samuel admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's something I need to tell you, but it's big, and I need you to be ready for it." Lauren raised a brow, her concern deepening. "What is it?" Samuel took a deep breath, sitting on the edge of her worn sofa. "It's about the child you were carrying before the accident," he began. "I didn't want to bring it up before, not until we had more information. But Jack found something." Lauren's face paled, and she gripped the back of a chair for support. "My child," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You mean?" Samuel nodded, his voice steady but gentle. "Lauren, your child survived, and he's alive." Lauren's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. I had flashes, dreams of holding a baby, but I thought they were just fragments of my imagination." "Are you saying he's real?" Samuel reached out to take her hand. "He's real. His name is Dylan, and he's 23 years old. He works as a lawyer in New York City. Jack traced his adoption records. He was placed in an orphanage after the accident." Tears spilled down Lauren's cheeks as she sank into a chair. "An orphanage," she murmured. "All this time, he's been out there, thinking he had no one." Samuel nodded, his own voice thick with emotion. "He grew up without us, Lauren, but he's built an incredible life for himself. He's fighting for people who can't fight for themselves, working at an NGO that helps the underprivileged. He's extraordinary." Lauren's heart ached at the thought of the son she had never known, the years they had lost. "Does he know about us?" Samuel hesitated. "Not yet. I haven't reached out to him. I wanted to talk to you first. This isn't something I can or should do alone." Lauren wiped her tears, her voice steadying with resolve. "We have to find him, Samuel. He deserves to know the truth." The journey to New York City was long and filled with silence. Lauren stared out the window, her mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, hope, regret. Samuel occasionally glanced at her, wondering what was running through her mind but deciding to give her space. He knew this wasn't easy for her. It wasn't easy for him either. When they arrived at the NGO where Dylan worked, Lauren's hands trembled as she adjusted her coat. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said softly. She nodded, drawing in a deep breath before they walked into the modest office building. Inside, the atmosphere was bustling but warm, with people hurrying about, papers in hand, and the faint sound of a phone ringing in the background. "May I help you?" a young receptionist asked, looking up from her desk. "We're here to see Dylan," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked politely. "It's personal," Samuel replied. "If you could just tell him Lauren and Samuel Carter are here, I think he'll want to see us." The receptionist hesitated, glancing between them, before picking up the phone. A few moments later, she nodded. "He'll be right out." Lauren's heart pounded as they waited. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, the door to the back office opened, and a young man stepped out. Dylan was tall and lean, with sharp features and an air of confidence that came from years of advocating for others. His eyes, however, were what caught Lauren's attention. They were unmistakably hers. Her breath hitched as she took in the sight of him, her son, standing just a few feet away. "Hi," Dylan said, his tone cautious but friendly. "I'm Dylan. What can I do for you?" Lauren's voice caught in her throat, and Samuel stepped in. "Hello, Dylan. My name is Samuel Carter, and this is Lauren Whitman," he began, his tone measured. "We're here because we believe we're your biological parents." Dylan's eyes widened, and he took a step back. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "It's a lot to take in, I know," Samuel continued, "but it's the truth. We've been searching for answers, and we discovered your adoption records. You were placed in an orphanage after a bus accident 23 years ago." Dylan's expression shifted from shock to guarded suspicion. "And I'm just supposed to believe this, that you're my parents." Lauren stepped forward, her voice trembling but filled with sincerity. "I don't expect you to believe us right away," she said, "but I've dreamed of you, of holding you in my arms. I thought I lost you forever. Please, Dylan, Just give us a chance to explain." Dylan crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "Why now? Why did it take you 23 years to show up?" Samuel met his gaze evenly. "Because we thought we lost you too. Your mother survived the accident but lost her memory. She only recently began recovering pieces of her past. And when we found out about you, we came as soon as we could." Dylan looked at them both, his emotions a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "I need time," he said finally. "This is a lot." "We understand," Lauren said softly, her eyes pleading. "But please, don't shut the door on us completely." Dylan hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll think about it." As he walked away, Lauren turned to Samuel, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and longing. "We found him," she whispered. "But will he ever truly let us in?" Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll give him the time he needs. The truth has a way of bringing people together." The ride back to the hotel was quiet, the air between Samuel and Lauren thick with unspoken emotions. Lauren stared out of the window, her thoughts consumed by the brief but seismic encounter with Dylan. Her heart ached at the guarded look in his eyes, the walls he had clearly built around himself. Samuel kept glancing at her, wanting to say something but unsure of the right words. When they arrived at the hotel, Lauren sank into the armchair by the window, her fingers gripping the edges as if grounding herself. "Did you see the way he looked at us?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like we were strangers." Samuel sat across from her, his expression calm but resolute. "He's had an entire life without us, Lauren. We can't expect him to embrace this overnight." Lauren's eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded. I've imagined this moment for so long, and now that it's happened, it feels like we're further away from him than ever." Samuel leaned forward, his voice steady. "He didn't shut the door, Lauren. That's what matters. We gave him something to think about now. We give him space." Lauren sighed, the weight of Samuel's words settling over her. "Space," she repeated. "But what if he decides he doesn't want to know us at all?" Samuel reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Then we keep trying. We're not giving up on him." The next morning, Samuel reached out to Jack for an update, while they waited for Dylan to process the truth. Samuel was determined to continue uncovering the full story of what had happened to Lauren and their son. "Jack, it's Samuel," he said when the call connected. "I need you to dig deeper into Dylan's adoption. I want to know who placed him in the orphanage and how Anthony Whitman was involved." "I'm already on it," Jack replied. "I've found some discrepancies in the adoption paperwork. It looks like someone pulled strings to make it happen quickly and quietly. I'll let you know when I have more." Samuel thanked him and hung up, his thoughts returning to Dylan. He couldn't shake the image of the young man's face, so much like Lauren's, yet hardened by a life of independence and struggle. Samuel respected that strength, but hoped Dylan would allow room for something more: connection. Meanwhile, Dylan sat in his small office at the Ngo, staring at a stack of case files he hadn't touched in hours. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The encounter with Samuel and Lauren replaying in his head like a broken record. Could it be true? Could these two strangers really be his parents? He opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out the small silver locket he'd carried since he was a child. The orphanage director had told him it was found with him when he was brought in. Dylan had always wondered who it had belonged to, but after years of no answers, he'd stopped asking. Now, he wasn't so sure. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. His colleague and close friend Maya stepped in, her brow furrowed in concern. "You okay?" she asked, closing the door behind her. "You've been zoned out all day." Dylan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know where to start, Maya." She sat across from him, her arms crossed. "Try me." Dylan hesitated before recounting the encounter with Samuel and Lauren. When he finished, Maya's eyes widened in shock. "Wait, they just showed up and dropped this bombshell on you?" "Pretty much," Dylan said, leaning back in his chair. "It's insane, right? How could this be real?" Maya tilted her head thoughtfully. "I mean, it's a lot to process, but do you believe them?" "I don't know," Dylan admitted. "But the timing, the details, it all lines up too perfectly to be a coincidence. And then there's this." He held up the locket, letting it dangle between his fingers. They didn't see it, but what if it connects to them somehow? Maya studied the locket, her expression softening. You've carried that thing for as long as I've known you. Maybe it's time to find out what it really means. Dylan frowned. And what if it's not what I want to hear? Then at least you'll know, Maya said gently. But you'll never get answers if you keep running from it. Her words stuck with Dylan long after she left. By the end of the day, he made a decision. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled to the number Samuel had left on the business card he'd handed him. After a moment's hesitation, he dialed. Samuel and Lauren were sitting in the hotel lounge when Samuel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and froze. It's him, he said, his voice low. Lauren's eyes widened, her breath catching. Answer it. Samuel swiped to accept the call. Dylan, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. It's good to hear from you. There was a pause on the other end before Dylan spoke. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, and I want to meet again. But this time, I need proof. Something concrete. Samuel nodded, even though Dylan couldn't see him. We understand. We'll give you whatever you need. Tomorrow, Dylan said. Same place. We'll be there, Samuel replied. When the call ended, he looked at Lauren, who was already on the verge of tears. He wants to meet again, Samuel said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He's giving us a chance. Lauren exhaled shakily, her relief palpable. We'll give him everything, she said firmly. Whatever it takes. Samuel nodded, his own resolve strengthening. This was their opportunity to begin rebuilding the bridge to their son, and they weren't going to waste it. Samuel and Lauren arrived at the NGO the following morning, their emotions a mixture of hope and apprehension. Lauren clutched the edge of her coat tightly, her breath visible in the chilly New York air. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before they stepped inside. Dylan was waiting for them in the same modest conference room where they had first spoken. This time, his demeanor was more guarded, his arms crossed as they entered. He gestured toward the table. Let's get to it, he said curtly. Samuel and Lauren exchanged a glance before taking their seats. Samuel reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. We understand you need proof, he began, sliding the folder across the table. These are your adoption records, along with documentation from the orphanage that cared for you. It includes the locket you were found with and details about the accident that separated us. Dylan eyed the folder warily before opening it. He scanned the documents, his brows furrowing as he flipped through pages. When he came to the photograph of the locket, he froze. This, he said, holding up the image, his voice barely above a whisper. This is mine. Lauren leaned forward, her heart pounding. You've kept it all these years. Dylan nodded slowly. It's the only thing I've ever had that connected me to. Anything. I never knew what it meant, but I couldn't bring myself to let it go. Lauren's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she spoke. That locket was mine. It was a gift from Samuel. I wore it the day of the accident. Dylan stared at her, his guarded expression beginning to crack. So, you're saying this is real? You're really my parents? Samuel leaned forward, his tone calm but insistent. Yes, Dylan, we are. And we've been searching for the truth ever since we found Lauren again. Dylan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the table. It's a lot to take in, he admitted. I've spent my entire life thinking I didn't belong to anyone. Now you're telling me I have this whole other story I didn't even know about. Lauren reached out tentatively, her hand hovering over his. I can't imagine how overwhelming this must be, she said softly. But please know this. We've never stopped wanting you, even when we didn't know you were out there. Dylan's eyes flicked to hers, a flicker of emotion breaking through his stoic demeanor. If this is true, he said, then why did it take you so long to find me? Samuel answered carefully. Because we thought we'd lost you. After the accident, Lauren was taken to a convent and suffered memory loss for years. Anthony Whitman, her father, kept us apart. He erased her, and he erased you. Dylan's jaw tightened at the mention of Anthony. And what about him? Why would my grandfather do something like this? Samuel exhaled sharply. We believe it was to protect his political career. He's a man who values control and image above everything else. You and Lauren didn't fit into his version of perfection. Dylan shook his head, his frustration evident. So, I was just a problem he needed to get rid of. Lauren's voice cracked as she spoke. No, Dylan. You were never a problem. You were my child. Our child. I wish I could go back and change everything. But all I can do now is try to make things right. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence stretching as Dylan processed their words. Finally, he stood, pacing the room. I've built my entire life around the idea of independence, around not needing anyone, he said. Now you're telling me I have a family, that the life I thought I knew was a lie. Samuel stood as well, his voice steady. We're not asking you to change who you are, Dylan. We're just asking for a chance to be a part of your life. Dylan stopped pacing, turning to face them. And Anthony, what happens to him? Are you planning to confront him? Samuel exchanged a glance with Lauren before answering. Yes, we're gathering evidence to hold him accountable for everything he's done. To you, to Lauren, to everyone affected by his actions. Dylan nodded, his expression unreadable. Good, he said, because if what you're saying is true, then he doesn't get to walk away from this. Lauren took a cautious step toward him. Dylan, I know this is a lot to ask, but will you give us a chance? Even just a small one? Dylan hesitated, his gaze softening as he looked at her. I don't know, he admitted. But I'm not saying no. Lauren's breath caught, and she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. That's all I could hope for. As Dylan walked them to the door, Samuel paused. Dylan, if you ever want to talk about anything, you can reach out, no pressure. Dylan nodded. I'll think about it. As they left, Lauren wiped at her tears, her heart heavy but hopeful. He didn't say no, she said, her voice filled with cautious optimism. That's something. Samuel nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. It's a start. We'll take it one step at a time. But as they walked back to their car, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that their battle with Anthony was far from over, and that the road to healing their family would only grow more treacherous. The next few days were a waiting game for Lauren and Samuel. Dylan hadn't reached out since their last meeting, leaving them both to wrestle with their emotions in silence. Lauren spent her mornings by the window of their hotel room, staring out at the New York skyline, her thoughts drifting back to the brief glimpse of connection she'd felt with Dylan. Samuel, ever the pragmatist, kept himself busy with updates from Jack Reynolds. The investigators' work was uncovering more and more about Anthony Whitman's dark web of secrets. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, Samuel's focus remained on his son. Both he and Lauren knew that reuniting their family wouldn't be as simple as uncovering the truth. It was a rainy afternoon when Lauren's phone buzzed on the table. She jumped at the sound, her heart racing as she picked it up. It was a text message. From Dylan. Can we meet tomorrow? Just the two of us? I have questions. Lauren's breath hitched as she read the words. She turned to Samuel, her voice trembling with a mix of nerves and hope. He wants to meet me alone. Samuel nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That's a good sign. He wants to hear from you, Lauren. He's giving you a chance. Lauren's fingers tightened around the phone. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I push him further away? Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You'll do fine. Just be honest with him. He needs to hear your story, your truth. The next day, Lauren arrived at a small cafe Dylan had suggested. The rain had cleared, leaving the air crisp and cool. She spotted Dylan at a table near the window, his posture relaxed but his expression serious. He looked up as she approached, offering a faint nod of acknowledgement. Hi, Lauren said softly, taking the seat across from him. Hi, Dylan replied, his tone neutral. He studied her for a moment before speaking again. Thanks for coming. Thank you for reaching out, Lauren said, her hands resting nervously on the table. I've been hoping we could talk. Dylan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he began, about everything you and Samuel told me, about the locket, the adoption papers. It's hard to process. I understand, Lauren said gently. I can't imagine how overwhelming this must be for you. Dylan nodded, his gaze fixed on her. But there's one thing I keep coming back to, he continued. If what you're saying is true, then why didn't you fight for me? Why didn't you come for me sooner? Lauren's heart ached at the question. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before answering. I lost you the day of the accident, she said, her voice trembling. When I woke up in that hospital, I didn't even remember my own name. For years, I lived in a convent, not knowing who I was or what had happened to me. I didn't even know I had a son. Dylan's expression softened, though he still looked skeptical. And when you did remember, it didn't happen all at once, Lauren explained. The memories came back in pieces, flashes of your face, of holding you. By the time I started putting it all together, so much time had passed, and I didn't even know where to begin looking for you. Samuel found me only recently. Together, we started uncovering the truth about what happened. Dylan studied her, his guarded expression betraying a flicker of emotion. So, it was him who found me. Yes, Lauren said. He's the one who uncovered your adoption records. He's been relentless in finding answers. For both of us. Dylan leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. And Anthony, what's his role in all of this? Lauren hesitated, choosing her words carefully. He's the reason we were separated. He orchestrated everything. The accident, the adoption. He wanted me out of his life, and he wanted you out of mine. Dylan's jaw tightened. Why? Lauren's voice faltered. Because of his pride, his need for control. He saw my pregnancy as a threat to his reputation, and he did whatever it took to protect himself. Dylan was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. Finally, he looked up at her, his voice quiet but firm. I don't know if I can forgive him for that. You don't have to, Lauren said softly, but I hope, in time. You can forgive me. Dylan's gaze met hers, and for the first time, the hardness in his expression seemed to crack. I don't know, he admitted, but I think I want to try. Tears welled in Lauren's eyes, and she reached across the table, her hand hovering just above his. That's all I could ever ask for, she said. Dylan hesitated before placing his hand over hers, the gesture tentative but full of promise. I want to know more, he said. About you, about Samuel, about what happened. Lauren nodded, her tears spilling over as she smiled. I'll tell you everything, whatever you want to know. When Lauren returned to the hotel that evening, Samuel was waiting anxiously in the lobby. The moment he saw her face, his shoulders relaxed. How did it go? He asked, his voice laced with hope. Lauren smiled, her eyes still red from crying. He wants to try. He wants to know us. Samuel exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. That's all we needed. Lauren nodded, a renewed sense of determination in her voice. But he has questions, and sooner or later, we'll need to confront Anthony. Dylan deserves the full truth. Samuel's expression hardened. Then that's what we'll give him. It's time to bring Anthony Whitman's lies to light. The days following Lauren and Dylan's emotional meeting were a mixture of cautious hope and lingering tension. While Dylan had agreed to learn more about his biological parents, his wariness toward Samuel was still palpable. Samuel, on the other hand, respected the distance Dylan maintained, but silently yearned for a breakthrough that would bring them closer. One afternoon, Dylan sent a text to Lauren, asking to meet again, this time with both her and Samuel present. Lauren read the message aloud to Samuel, her voice tinged with a mix of optimism and apprehension. He's ready to meet us together, she said, glancing up at him. Do you think that's a good sign? Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. It's progress, he said, but let's not rush him. He still needs time to figure out how he feels about everything. Lauren nodded, but the worry in her eyes was evident. I just hope we don't lose him before we even have the chance to truly reconnect. The three of them met at a quiet park in the late afternoon. The autumn leaves, shades of gold and crimson, crunched beneath their feet as they found a secluded bench near a small pond. Dylan stood with his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable as Samuel and Lauren approached. Thanks for meeting us, Lauren began, her voice gentle. Dylan nodded, his eyes briefly meeting hers before shifting to Samuel. I have questions, he said bluntly, and I need straight answers. No sugarcoating. Of course, Samuel replied, his tone even. Dylan took a deep breath, his hands tightening into fists. Why didn't you try harder to find me? I understand that Lauren didn't remember. But you, he pointed directly at Samuel, his voice sharp. You knew she was pregnant. Why didn't you look for me when the accident happened? Samuel's jaw tightened as he absorbed the weight of the question. He met Dylan's gaze, his voice steady, but filled with regret. "I did look for you after the accident. I was told that Lauren had died, and there were no survivors from her bus. I had no reason to believe otherwise." Dylan's eyes narrowed. "You just believed what you were told, didn't you think to dig deeper?" Samuel's voice softened. "I was shattered, Dylan. Losing Lauren was the hardest thing I'd ever faced. At the time, I didn't know about you. I only found out about her pregnancy recently when Lauren's memories started returning." Dylan's expression flickered with a mix of anger and confusion. "So, you just gave up?" Samuel shook his head. "I didn't give up. I buried myself in work because I couldn't face the pain. I know that's not the answer you want to hear, but it's the truth." Dylan turned his gaze to Lauren, his voice quieter but still tense. "And you? Do you even remember me? Or am I just a name to you?" Lauren's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out tentatively. "You're not just a name, Dylan. I may not remember everything, but the flashes I've had, they've always been of you, holding you, loving you, even when I didn't know who I was. I felt the loss of something, someone, so deeply. That was you." Dylan's jaw clenched, and he looked away, his emotions clearly warring within him. "It's hard to reconcile this," he admitted. "For 23 years, I've lived with the idea that I had no family, and now you're here, telling me that my whole life was stolen from me." Samuel nodded. "It was stolen, from all of us, but now that we've found you, we want to make it right." Dylan laughed bitterly. "Make it right? How do you even begin to fix something like this?" Lauren took a deep breath, her voice steady despite her tears. "By being here, by answering your questions, giving you space, and showing you that we're not going anywhere." Dylan was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the pond. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "I don't know how to trust this. Trust you." Samuel and Lauren exchanged a glance, understanding the depth of Dylan's pain. Samuel spoke first, his tone calm but firm. "We're not asking you to trust us overnight, Dylan. That's something we'll have to earn. But we're here, and we're not giving up on you." Dylan turned back to face them, his expression softening slightly. "Then prove it," he said. "Because I'm not ready to forgive or forget. Not yet." As they parted ways, Lauren felt both relief and sadness. She looked at Samuel as they walked back to their car, her voice breaking. "Do you think he'll ever fully accept us?" Samuel's expression was thoughtful, his gaze distant. "He's trying. Lauren, that's more than I could have hoped for at this stage. We have to give him time." Lauren nodded, though the ache in her heart remained. "I just want him to feel loved, Samuel. He spent his whole life thinking no one wanted him." Samuel placed an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We'll show him. Actions speak louder than words." That evening, as Dylan sat in his apartment, he replayed the conversation in his mind. He wanted to believe them, to feel the connection they so clearly wanted with him. But the walls he had built over the years were strong, and trust didn't come easily. His thoughts were interrupted by a buzz on his phone. It was a message from Maya, thinking about our talk. "You don't have to decide everything now, but don't shut them out before you know the whole story. You might regret it later." Dylan stared at the screen, her words lingering in his mind, with a sigh. He placed the phone on the table and opened the folder Samuel had given him. He thumbed through the documents again, his eyes landing on the photo of the locket. This was the one thing he'd carried with him his entire life, and now it connected him to a past he hadn't known existed for the first time. He allowed himself to wonder what it might feel like to let these strangers into his life. Not as strangers, but as family. Dylan paced his office, the weight of the previous day's conversation with Samuel and Lauren pressing heavily on his mind. Their words had stirred something deep within him, a mix of longing, anger, and confusion. He couldn't deny the evidence they'd provided or the sincerity in their voices, but trust was still a bridge too far. Lost in thought, Dylan was startled by the sudden ring of his phone. Glancing at the screen, he saw an unfamiliar number. Frowning, he hesitated before answering. "Hello, Dylan." A cold, authoritative voice greeted him. "This is Anthony Whitman." Dylan froze, his grip tightening on the phone. "Anthony Whitman," he repeated, his voice hardening. "What do you want?" "I'm calling to warn you," Anthony said sharply. "Those people you've been speaking with, Samuel Carter and Lauren Whitman. They're not who they claim to be. Dylan's chest tightened, his jaw clenching. What are you talking about? They're opportunists, Anthony continued, his tone calm but laced with menace. Samuel is a businessman with a history of manipulating people for his own gain, and Lauren, she's desperate and unstable. They've concocted this story to drag you into their chaos. Dylan's mind raced, his instincts screaming that something was off. You sound awfully interested in my relationship with them for someone who hasn't been in my life for 23 years, he shot back. I'm trying to protect you, Anthony replied coolly. I've kept an eye on you all these years, ensuring you had a stable life. Now they're trying to uproot everything. Dylan's laugh was bitter. Protect me by abandoning me in an orphanage. That's an interesting definition of protection. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Anthony spoke again, his tone shifting to something more calculated. You don't understand the full picture. Dylan, sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. Dylan's grip on the phone tightened. If you think I'm going to believe a word you're saying, you're more delusional than I thought. Anthony's voice turned icy. Be careful, Dylan. Associating with them could cost you more than you realize. The line went dead. Dylan sat in stunned silence, the conversation replaying in his mind. Anthony's words had been deliberate, laced with veiled threats. Despite his anger, a part of Dylan couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story than he knew. Could Samuel and Lauren be hiding something? Or was Anthony trying to manipulate him? Later that evening, Dylan met with Maya, hoping for clarity. They sat in their usual cafe, the warm hum of chatter around them providing a sense of normalcy. I don't trust him, Dylan said, his frustration evident. But I can't ignore what he said. What if there's some truth to it? Maya stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Do you really think Samuel and Lauren are lying to you? From everything you've told me? It sounds like they genuinely want to reconnect. Dylan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Why would Anthony go out of his way to call me now? He's never cared before. Because he's losing control, Maya said simply. If Samuel and Lauren are exposing the truth, Anthony has the most to lose. Think about it. Why would he be so desperate to warn you off if he wasn't afraid of what you might find out? Dylan sat back, her words sinking in. So, you think I should keep talking to them? Maya shrugged. I think you owe it to yourself to find out the full story. You've spent your whole life wondering about your past. Don't let him scare you away from the answers you deserve. The next day, Dylan texted Lauren, asking to meet her and Samuel. They agreed to meet at a park near Dylan's office, the crisp autumn air invigorating but laced with tension when Dylan arrived. He wasted no time. I got a call from Anthony, he said bluntly. He's trying to turn me against you. Samuel's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. What did he say? That you're manipulators, Dylan replied, his tone sharp. That you've made this all up for some kind of personal gain. Lauren's face fell, her voice trembling as she spoke. Dylan, you can't believe that. We would never. I didn't say I believe him, Dylan interrupted, his gaze intense. But I need to know. Is there anything you're not telling me? Anything at all? Samuel stepped forward, his voice steady. No. Everything we've told you is the truth. Anthony is a master manipulator. He'll say or do anything to keep his secrets buried. Dylan crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. So, what's next? How do we prove it? Lauren hesitated, glancing at Samuel. There's more we've been uncovering, she said carefully. About the accident. About how you ended up in the orphanage. But it's not just about proving Anthony's lies. It's about ensuring you have all the answers. Dylan's expression softened slightly, though his guard remained up. Then give me all the answers, he said. Because I'm not letting anyone control this narrative. Not Anthony, not you. Samuel nodded, his respect for Dylan growing. Fair enough, he said. We'll show you everything, but I need you to trust that we're on your side. Dylan sighed, the weight of their words settling over him. Trust isn't easy for me, he admitted, but I'm willing to keep listening. For now. Lauren's relief was palpable, and she stepped closer, her voice soft. That's all we ask. As they parted ways, Samuel and Lauren exchanged a glance. The battle for Dylan's trust was far from over. but they were determined to keep fighting. Meanwhile, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that Anthony's threats were just the beginning of a larger storm brewing. The morning was cold and gray as Dylan sat in his office, poring over the documents Samuel had given him. The more he read, the harder it became to deny the story his biological parents had told him. Every detail, from the adoption records to the orphanage's files, aligned with what they'd said, yet Anthony's voice still echoed in his mind, sowing doubt like a persistent shadow. The knock on his office door startled him. Maya peeked in, a concerned look on her face. "Hey," she said, stepping inside. "You've been holed up in here all morning. Everything okay?" Dylan rubbed his temples. "Not really. I've been going through all this," he said, gesturing to the scattered papers on his desk. "It all checks out, but I can't shake the feeling that there's more I'm not seeing." Maya sat across from him, her voice calm. "Then dig deeper. You've spent your whole career fighting for the truth. You owe it to yourself to do the same now." Dylan sighed, nodding. "You're right. And there's one person who might have the rest of the answers." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Anthony." "Exactly," Dylan said. "It's time I confront him." Later that day, Dylan called Samuel and Lauren, telling them his plan. Lauren's voice trembled with worry. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "Dylan, Anthony. He's dangerous." "That's exactly why I need to do this," Dylan said firmly. "I need to hear it from him. I need him to look me in the eye and explain why he did this." Samuel's voice was steady but filled with caution. "If you're going to confront him, we'll come with you." "No," Dylan said, shaking his head. "This is something I have to do alone. If he sees you two, he'll shut down. But if it's just me, maybe he'll slip." There was a pause on the line before Samuel responded, "All right, but if you need us, we'll be close by." The meeting was arranged at Anthony's sprawling estate just outside the city. As Dylan approached the towering iron gates, he couldn't help but feel a knot of anger twisting in his chest. This was the man who had shaped the course of his life without his knowledge, who had stolen not just his family, but his very identity. The butler ushered him into the grand living room, where Anthony sat by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in hand. He looked up as Dylan entered, his expression unreadable. "Dylan," Anthony said smoothly, gesturing for him to sit. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." Dylan ignored the offer, remaining standing. "I've been doing my own research," he began, his voice sharp. "And it's confirmed everything Samuel and Lauren told me." Anthony's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I see they've been filling your head with stories." "They're not stories," Dylan snapped. "They're the truth, and you've spent 23 years hiding it from me." Anthony stood, his imposing figure towering over Dylan. "You don't understand the sacrifices I've made for you," he said coldly. "Everything I did was for your protection." Dylan laughed bitterly. "Protection? You abandoned me. You erased my mother from existence. You left me to grow up thinking I had no one." Anthony's expression darkened, his mask of calm slipping. "Your mother was reckless," he said, his voice harsh. "She was a threat to everything I'd built. Her choices would have ruined us." "Her choices," Dylan repeated, his voice rising. "She loved me. She loved Samuel. You tore her life apart because of your ego." Anthony stepped closer, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "You don't know what it means to protect a legacy, Dylan. Sometimes hard decisions must be made." Dylan met his gaze, unflinching. "You mean crimes? Let's call them what they are." Anthony's eyes narrowed. "Careful, boy. You don't want to make me your enemy." Dylan's lips curved into a cold smile. "You already are, and I'm not afraid of you." As Dylan left the estate, his heart pounded with a mixture of adrenaline and fury. He had seen the cracks in Anthony's armor, the fear behind his threats. It was clear that Anthony's empire was built on lies, and Dylan was determined to bring it down. When he returned to his apartment, he called Samuel and Lauren, recounting the confrontation in vivid detail. "He's scared," Dylan concluded. "He knows his time is running out." Samuel's voice was firm. "Good, because Jack just delivered the final piece of the puzzle. We have the evidence to take him down." Lauren's voice trembled with a mix of relief and determination. "What kind of evidence?" Samuel hesitated, his tone turning somber. "Proof that Anthony was behind the bus accident. He orchestrated the entire thing, tampered with the brakes to ensure no one survived." Dylan's breath caught. "He tried to kill my mother. And you," Samuel said. "The crash wasn't just about Lauren. He wanted to erase everything that tied her to me, including you." Lauren's voice broke. "My father, he planned to kill us both." Dylan's anger boiled over. "Then we expose him. We take everything he's hiding and bring it into the light." Samuel's voice was steady. "That's exactly what we're going to do. It's time Anthony Whitman faces the consequences of his actions." That night, Dylan sat alone in his apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He stared at the locket in his hand, the small piece of metal that had connected him to a family he never knew existed for the first time in years. He felt a glimmer of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. Hope that justice would be served, and hope that, despite everything, he might finally find his place with the family he had always longed for. The following morning, Dylan woke with a newfound clarity. The pieces of his shattered past were beginning to fit together, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was taking control of his life. His determination to expose Anthony Whitman's crimes had solidified, and with the evidence Samuel and Jack had uncovered, he knew they had a real chance to bring him down. However, as Dylan prepared for the day, a strange unease settled over him. He dismissed it as nerves, a natural reaction to the storm they were about to unleash. He didn't realize how justified his feelings were until he stepped out of his apartment. Two men in dark suits were waiting near his car, their faces unreadable, but their presence unmistakably threatening. Dylan's steps slowed, his instincts screaming at him to turn around. But before he could retreat, one of the men approached, blocking his path. "Dylan Whitman?" the man asked, his voice calm but chilling. "Who's asking?" Dylan replied, his tone guarded. "We need you to come with us," the man said, his expression cold. Dylan's heart raced as he took a step back. "I don't think so." Before he could react further, the second man grabbed him from behind, a hand clamping over his mouth as they dragged him toward a black SUV parked nearby. Dylan struggled, his mind racing, but the men's grip was ironclad within moments. Then, he was shoved into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind him. One of the men climbed in next to him, while the other took the driver's seat. The vehicle pulled away, leaving Dylan's quiet street behind. Samuel and Lauren were in the middle of reviewing the evidence Jack had sent over when Samuel's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, frowning when he didn't recognize the number. "Hello? Mr. Carter," an unfamiliar voice said, low and menacing. "We have Dylan." Samuel's blood ran cold. "Who is this? What have you done with him?" "That's not important," the man replied. "What matters is what you do next. If you value Dylan's life, you'll stop your little crusade against Anthony Whitman. Destroy the evidence, walk away, and forget you ever dug into his past." Samuel's grip on the phone tightened. "If you hurt him..." "Careful, Mr. Carter," the man interrupted. "You're not in a position to make threats. You have 24 hours. Make the right choice." The line went dead. Lauren, who had been watching anxiously, rushed to Samuel's side. "What happened? Who was that?" Samuel's face was grim as he relayed the call. Lauren's eyes filled with panic. "They've taken him, Samuel. We have to do something." "We will," Samuel said firmly. "But we're not giving in to their demands. We're going to find Dylan and bring him home." Lauren nodded, her fear mingled with determination. "We need Jack." Samuel was already dialing the investigator's number. When Jack answered, Samuel wasted no time. "They've taken Dylan. We need you to trace the call I just received." "It came from a blocked number," Jack cursed under his breath. "I'll get on it right away. Sit tight. I'll call you as soon as I have something." Meanwhile, Dylan sat in the dimly lit room where his captors had taken him. His wrists were bound, his mouth taped, but his mind was sharp, working through every possible way to escape. The room was sparse. Concrete walls, a single chair, and a flickering light bulb overhead. He could hear muffled voices outside the door, the sound of his captors discussing their next move. Through the haze of fear, Dylan's anger burned bright. This wasn't just about him. It was about silencing the truth, about protecting Anthony Whitman's empire at any cost. But Dylan wasn't about to let them win. Back in the hotel, Jack called Samuel with an update. "I've got a lead," he said. "The call came from a burner phone, but I traced the signal to an industrial warehouse on the outskirts of the city. I'm sending you the coordinates now." "We're going," Samuel said without hesitation. Wait, Jack warned. You'll need backup. I've contacted the authorities, but they might not get there in time. Be careful. Samuel hung up and turned to Lauren, who was already grabbing her coat. We know where he is, he said. Lauren's face was set with determination. Then let's go. The drive to the warehouse was tense, the air between them charged with urgency. When they arrived, they parked a safe distance away and approached on foot. The warehouse loomed before them, its windows dark and its exterior weathered by time. Inside, Dylan heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. His heart raced as the door creaked open, revealing one of his captors. The man sneered. You're lucky we're under orders to keep you alive. But that could change. Dylan glared at him, his resolve unshaken. He didn't know if Samuel and Lauren had received the message, but he clung to the hope that they were out there, fighting to bring him home. Outside, Samuel and Lauren crouched near a side entrance, scanning the area for guards. Samuel spotted a heavy metal rod on the ground and picked it up, his grip firm. Lauren's hand rested on his arm. We have to be careful, she whispered. Samuel nodded. We will, but we're getting him out. They slipped inside, the dim light casting long shadows across the cavernous space. Voices echoed from a nearby room, guiding them toward Dylan's location. As they approached, Samuel motioned for Lauren to stay back while he crept forward, his makeshift weapon at the ready. Peering into the room, Samuel spotted Dylan tied to the chair, his captors standing nearby. Without hesitation, he burst in, the metal rod swinging as he took down the nearest man with a single blow. The second man lunged at him, but Lauren appeared in the doorway, wielding a loose plank she'd found outside. She struck the man across the back, sending him crashing to the ground. Dylan's eyes widened in shock and relief as Samuel and Lauren rushed to his side, untying his bonds. Are you okay? Lauren asked, her hands trembling as she freed him. I am now, Dylan said, his voice rough but steady. But we need to get out of here. They'll have backup. Samuel nodded, helping Dylan to his feet. Then let's move. As they slipped out of the warehouse and into the safety of the night, Dylan glanced at Samuel and Lauren, a new respect shining in his eyes. For the first time, he truly felt like part of a family willing to fight for him, no matter the cost. The drive back from the warehouse was silent. Save for the hum of the car engine, Dylan sat in the back seat, his wrists raw from the restraints, and his mind reeling from the events of the night. Samuel kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tight, while Lauren sat beside him, occasionally glancing back at Dylan with concern etched into her face. You didn't have to come for me, Dylan finally said, his voice breaking the silence. Samuel met his eyes briefly in the rearview mirror. Yes, we did. You're our son, Dylan. We'd do anything to protect you. Dylan swallowed hard, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had spent so much of his life building walls, convinced he was on his own. But tonight, those walls had been shaken. Lauren turned in her seat, her voice soft but firm. We'll always come for you, Dylan. Always. For the first time, Dylan allowed himself to nod, the weight of their words settling in. He didn't respond, but the unspoken gratitude in his expression was clear. Back at the hotel, Jack was waiting for them, his face grim. I've already notified the authorities, he said as they entered. They'll be raiding Anthony's estate within the next few hours. The evidence we have is airtight. Samuel nodded, his voice steady. Good. It's time he answers for what he's done. Dylan, still shaken, sat on the edge of the sofa, his head in his hands. What if he finds a way out of this? People like him always seem to. He won't, Samuel assured him. Not this time. He's made too many enemies, left too many loose ends. Jack chimed in. And with your testimony, Dylan, we'll seal the case against him. Dylan looked up, his expression conflicted. Testimony? You're a key part of this, Jack explained. Your story, your connection to Anthony. It's the final nail in the coffin. Dylan's jaw tightened as he processed Jack's words. He hated the idea of facing Anthony again, of revisiting the pain and betrayal. But he knew they were right. I'll do it, he said quietly. He deserves to face what he's done. Lauren moved to his side, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. We'll be with you every step of the way. The next morning, the authorities carried out a raid on Anthony's estate. News of his arrest spread quickly, with headlines detailing the long list of charges against him: conspiracy, fraud, endangerment, and, most damning of all, orchestrating the fatal bus accident that had nearly taken Lauren and Dylan's lives. Dylan watched the coverage from the hotel room, his emotions a tangled mix of relief and anger. Samuel sat beside him, a quiet strength in his presence. "You did the right thing," he said. Dylan nodded but remained silent, his thoughts drifting to the years of pain Anthony had caused. Later that afternoon, they received a call from the district attorney's office. Anthony had requested a meeting with Dylan before the trial. The request was unexpected, and Dylan's initial reaction was to refuse. But after discussing it with Samuel and Lauren, he decided to go. "I need to hear it from him," Dylan said. "I need to understand why." The meeting took place in a sterile room at the courthouse, the atmosphere heavy with tension. Anthony sat on one side of the table, his once commanding presence diminished. Dylan entered the room with Samuel and Lauren by his side, their support a steadying force. Anthony's eyes met Dylan's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Anthony broke the silence. "I didn't expect you to come. I need answers," Dylan said bluntly. "Why did you do it? Why did you take everything from me?" Anthony's expression hardened, though there was a flicker of something resembling regret in his eyes. "You were a complication," he said coldly. "Your mother's choices threatened everything I had built." "Choices," Dylan repeated, his voice rising. "You mean falling in love and having a child? That was her crime." Anthony's composure faltered, and for a brief moment, he looked like a man undone. "I thought I was protecting her," he said quietly. "And you weren't protecting us," Lauren interjected, her voice shaking with anger. "You were protecting yourself. You destroyed our lives for your own selfish pride." Anthony's gaze shifted to her, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to Dylan. "I can't undo the past," he said, "but I am sorry." Dylan stood, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "Your apology doesn't change anything. You stole years from me, years I can never get back. But I'm not going to let your actions define my future." With that, Dylan walked out of the room, leaving Anthony behind. Outside the courthouse, Dylan turned to Samuel and Lauren. For the first time, his expression was free of doubt. "I'm ready to move forward," he said. "With both of you." Lauren's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled him into a tight embrace. Samuel placed a hand on Dylan's shoulder, his voice filled with emotion. "We're proud of you, son." Dylan smiled faintly, the weight of the past finally beginning to lift. Together they walked away from the courthouse, united as a family determined to rebuild what had been lost. The weeks following Anthony Whitman's arrest were a whirlwind of change for Dylan. The courtroom battles had been grueling, but they marked the start of something new. The truth was finally out in the open, and justice was beginning to take its course. Despite the turmoil, Dylan found himself leaning more and more on Samuel and Lauren, their steady presence grounding him as he navigated the storm of emotions tied to his rediscovered past. Samuel's mansion, which once seemed imposing and sterile, now felt like a sanctuary. The sprawling halls were slowly filled with laughter, conversation, and the unmistakable hum of life. Lauren often cooked meals in the large, gleaming kitchen, inviting Dylan to join her in sharing stories about her youth before her memories were stolen. Samuel, though less vocal, made his presence felt with small gestures, an encouraging word, a thoughtful glance, or a firm but gentle hand on Dylan's shoulder. One crisp morning, Dylan stood on the balcony of Samuel's home. Overlooking the sprawling gardens below, the cool air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and the early sun cast a golden glow across the property. Samuel joined him, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You've been quiet," Samuel said, handing one mug to Dylan. "What's on your mind?" Dylan took a sip. "Dylan," the warmth spreading through him as he considered the question. "It's strange," he admitted. "For so long I was on my own. I didn't have anyone to rely on. And now, suddenly, I have. All of this. You, Lauren, everything. It's overwhelming." Samuel leaned against the railing, his gaze thoughtful. "I can't imagine how difficult it's been for you, but I want you to know that you don't have to figure it all out at once. You have time, Dylan. We're not going anywhere." Dylan glanced at Samuel, the sincerity in his words striking a chord. "It's not just that," he said after a pause. "I've spent so much of my life fighting for others, fighting to survive. I don't know how to just be." Samuel smiled faintly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I know that feeling. When Lauren disappeared, I buried myself in work because I didn't know what else to do. But it's okay to stop fighting sometimes, to let yourself feel, to let yourself heal." Dylan nodded, though the concept still felt foreign. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "That's all anyone can ask." Samuel replied, "You're doing better than you think." Later that day, Lauren joined Dylan in the library, her arms full of photo albums she had insisted on digging out of storage. "You need to see these," she said with a smile. Setting them down on the table, "I managed to save a few pictures from before everything." Dylan hesitated before flipping open the first album. The pages were filled with images of a young Lauren, her eyes bright and full of life, and a much younger Samuel, his expression softer and less burdened than Dylan had ever seen. There were photos of the two of them at picnics, smiling in the sunlight, and even a few candid shots that captured them laughing together. "I wish I remembered these moments," Lauren said softly, sitting beside him, looking at these pictures. "It's like glimpsing a life I never got to live." Dylan studied a photo of Lauren holding a bouquet of flowers, her smile radiant. "You look happy," he said. "I was," Lauren replied, her voice tinged with both warmth and sorrow. "And I am now because I have you back." Dylan met her gaze, the weight of her words settling over him. "It's still hard for me to wrap my head around all this," he admitted. "But I'm glad I found you." Lauren's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "We're glad we found you too." As the days turned into weeks, Dylan began to settle into a rhythm. He split his time between work at the NGO and moments spent with Samuel and Lauren, each day feeling a little more natural than the last. One evening, over dinner, Samuel brought up the idea of traveling. "You've spent so much time helping others," Samuel said. "Maybe it's time to do something for yourself. See the world. Take a break." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting I just drop everything and take a vacation?" "I'm suggesting you think about it," Samuel said with a smile. "Life isn't just about work, Dylan. It's about experiences, connections, memories, and you've got plenty of time to make up for." Lauren chimed in. "I've always wanted to see Europe," she said. "Maybe we could all go together." Dylan chuckled, though the idea wasn't as far-fetched as it once would have seemed. "I'll think about it," he said. One night, as Dylan sat in his room, he received a text from Maya. "How's the family thing going?" Dylan smiled faintly as he typed back. "Better than I expected. They're different, but in a good way." Her reply came almost instantly. "You deserve this, Dylan. Don't let your walls get in the way." "Let them in." Dylan stared at the screen for a long moment, her words sinking in. Slowly, he set his phone down and picked up the locket he had carried with him since childhood. It had been a symbol of his unknown past, but now it felt like a bridge to the future. The next morning, Dylan joined Samuel and Lauren in the dining room, a sense of purpose settling over him. "I've been thinking," he began, setting the locket on the table. "Maybe it's time I stopped holding back. Maybe it's time I let myself believe this. Us can work." Lauren's face lit up with a smile, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Dylan, that's all we've ever wanted." Samuel nodded, his voice steady. "We're here for you, no matter what." For the first time, Dylan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer the only part of his story. Together, they were building something new, something worth holding on to. The days leading up to the sentencing hearing for Anthony Whitman were filled with quiet reflection and planning. Dylan, Samuel, and Lauren had come a long way since their first awkward and tense reunions. They had forged a bond through shared pain, resilience, and a determination to reclaim what had been stolen from them. On the morning of the hearing, Dylan dressed carefully, his movements deliberate. The weight of the day wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about justice. It was about closure, about finally laying the ghosts of his past to rest. Samuel and Lauren waited for him in the foyer of Samuel's mansion, their expressions calm but resolute. Lauren wore a simple but elegant dress, her posture straight as she clasped her hands together. Samuel's suit was sharp, his tie perfectly knotted, yet his eyes carried the same determination that Dylan saw every time they faced a challenge together. "You ready?" Samuel asked as Dylan descended the stairs. "As ready as I'll ever be," Dylan replied, his voice steady. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, the air heavy with unspoken tension. As Dylan took his seat between Samuel and Lauren, he caught sight of Anthony being led into the room, his hands cuffed and his expression grim. Anthony's once commanding presence had withered under the weight of his crimes. His sharp suits had been replaced with the bland uniform of a prisoner, and his haughty demeanor was tempered by the reality of his circumstances. For a fleeting moment, Dylan felt a pang of something. Pity, perhaps, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memories of everything Anthony had done. The hearing began, the prosecutor presenting the final evidence against Anthony. Jack's meticulous investigation had uncovered damning details that painted a clear picture of Anthony's decades-long pattern of manipulation, greed, and violence. As the judge read through the charges and testimonies, Dylan felt a sense of vindication. The truth was finally being spoken aloud, in a space where it could no longer be denied. When it was time for the victims to speak, Dylan stood. The room seemed to hold its breath as he approached the podium, his steps deliberate and firm. Dylan's voice was steady as he began. "For 23 years, I lived a life shaped by lies I didn't even know existed. I grew up believing I was alone, that no one wanted me, and that my past was a void I could never fill. What I didn't know was that my family was out there. My mother, who fought to survive despite everything you did to erase her. And my father, who never stopped searching for the truth." He glanced at Anthony, who met his gaze with a blank stare. "You took everything from us. You didn't just try to destroy a family. You tried to rewrite reality to suit your selfish desires. And for what? Power. Image. Your legacy is nothing but destruction." Dylan's voice softened, but his words cut no less sharply. "I've spent years helping people who've been hurt by others like you. People who think they can manipulate the world to their will. And every time, I've seen one thing. The truth always comes out. No matter how deeply you bury it, no matter how much you try to silence it, the truth always wins." As he stepped down, Lauren squeezed his hand, her eyes brimming with pride. Samuel gave him a firm nod, his expression filled with quiet approval. When the judge handed down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, a collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the room. Anthony was led away, his face betraying no emotion, and Dylan felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing as questions were shouted from every direction. Samuel shielded Lauren and Dylan, guiding them to a waiting car as the door closed behind them. Lauren exhaled deeply, her hands trembling slightly. "It's over," she said softly. "It's really over." Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It is. And now we can move forward." Dylan leaned back in his seat, the tension slowly draining from his body. "Forward," he repeated. "I like the sound of that." The weeks that followed were a time of healing and rebuilding. Dylan took a leave of absence from his work at the NGO, deciding to focus on reconnecting with Samuel and Lauren. They began making plans for a trip to Europe, a way to create new memories and celebrate the family they were becoming. One evening, as the three of them sat on the patio overlooking Samuel's gardens, Dylan spoke up. "There's something I've been thinking about," he began, his tone thoughtful. "I spent so much time running from the idea of family, convinced it wasn't something I'd ever have. But now, I want to stay. For a while, at least. I want to be part of this." Lauren's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for his hand. "You have no idea how much that means to me," she said. Samuel smiled, his voice steady. "This is your home, Dylan, for as long as you want it to be." Dylan nodded, his heart full. "It's not just a place," he said. "It's you, both of you. For the first time in my life, I feel like I belong." As the sun set, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the three of them sat together, their laughter mingling with the evening breeze. The past had left its scars, but it had also brought them to this moment, a moment of unity, hope, and love. Together, they faced a future that was no longer defined by loss, but by the strength they had found in one another. For Dylan, Samuel, and Lauren, The story was no longer about what had been taken. It was about what they had rebuilt, together.